It began on a Sunday morning. The choir sang as sunlight spilled through the stained glass, each note pure, perfect, until one changed everything. A single voice faltered, just for a second. And in that break of harmony, Sherlock Holmes heard something no one else did, a message hidden inside the melody. After the service, he found the hymn book, folded between the verses, pressed so carefully it almost vanished into the page. Was a handwritten note, no name, no signature, just a line that whispered, "He will return when the bells fall silent," because sometimes music doesn't just fill the air, it carries secrets through it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this make your heart race, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because every story here brings us one step closer to the mind of Sherlock Holmes. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit back, and listen closely. This is Sherlock Holmes and the Note Hidden in a Hymn. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a raw March morning, with the wind moaning through the chimney and the fire in our Baker Street hearth struggling for mastery over the draught, that I found Sherlock Holmes deep in the folds of his armchair, his long fingers steepled and his gaze fixed upon the curling tendrils of smoke from his pipe. I had thought him in one of those moods of silent abstraction that heralded some intricate experiment or piece of private research, when a sudden, sharp rapping at the door startled us both from our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual quiet efficiency, bearing the visiting card of Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard. I noted the faint tightening about Holmes's eyes as he read the name. "Well, Watson," said he, "if Gregson calls before breakfast, we may conclude that London has provided him with a problem both urgent and perplexing." Gregson was ushered in, his tall, spare figure looking even more angular than usual in the dim morning light. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "It's a queer business, Mr. Holmes, one of the queerest I've seen. A church in Westminster. A choirmaster found dead at the organ. No sign of a struggle. Nothing disturbed save for one sheet of music lying on the keys. And in that sheet, hidden between the staves, a note written in cipher." Holmes's languid manner vanished in an instant. "Pray proceed, Inspector. Spare me no detail." Gregson obliged, though the facts seemed only to deepen the mystery. The victim, Mr. Alistair Hume, had been a respected figure in St. Anne's Parish for nearly 2 decades, with no known enemies and a spotless reputation. He had been discovered at dawn by the verger, slumped over the great pipe organ as though in mid-performance, though no service had been scheduled. The only anomaly, a single page of a hymn, "Abide with Me," left in place. Beneath the notes, in a hand unknown, was a tiny inscription in what appeared to be a series of dots and dashes. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. A message concealed in plain sight within a hymn. Curious. And the cause of death? Gregson hesitated. The doctor on the scene could not be certain. No wounds, no signs of poison at first glance. Yet the man is dead, all the same. It's as if he stopped, as though unwilling to finish the thought, as if, Holmes supplied dryly, death had arrived upon a breath of music. For my part, I found the notion unnerving. The echo of that lonely church, the faint image of a man leaning over the keys in eternal silence, it was a scene to chill one's blood. "You'll come, then?" Gregson pressed. Before the yard decides, it's a matter of heart failure, and shelves it away. Holmes rose, his decision already made. Watson, your hat and coat. If our good inspector has not mistaken the scent, we are bound for Westminster and for a crime that speaks in the language of hymns. As we stepped into the mist-veiled street, Holmes was silent, his gaze fixed far ahead. I knew that look well it meant that, in some hidden corner of his mind, the case had already begun to play its first mysterious notes. Chapter 2. A hymn in the fogla. Hansom rattled through the damp streets, the hooves of the horse striking hollow notes upon the cobbles as the morning fog thickened about us. Holmes sat opposite me, his lean form swaying gently with the motion, his eyes half closed, but his mind, if the faint twitch of his fingers was any indication, working with feverish precision. Gregson, seated beside me, muttered a few details to himself as though rehearsing his report. But Holmes made no effort to engage him. It was not until we crossed into the shadow of Westminster spires that my companion stirred the organ. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you are certain the page was left in place and not slipped there after discovery?" "Certain as I can be, Mr. Holmes," Gregson replied. "The verger swears he found the body, just saw music, still on the stand, the man leaning over it. Only when he called for help did anyone else enter." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment, but did not speak again until we reached St. Anne's. The church rose out of the fog like some ancient sentinel, its stonework dark with centuries of soot and rain. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint tang of candle wax. The vast nave lay in dim shadow, and our footfalls echoed faintly on the flagstones as we made our way toward the chancel. The organ loomed there, pipes climbing like a forest of silver trees into the gloom. A single shaft of watery light fell across the bench where Alistair Hume had met his end. The scene was, as Gregson had described, the hymn page still upon the stand. Its familiar title, "Abide with Me," printed in bold type above neat rows of notation. Holmes approached without a word, leaning so close that I feared he might smudge the ink. He took a small magnifying lens from his pocket and traced the rows with its glass. "These marks," he murmured at last, "are not the work of the printer. Ink laid after the fact, and with deliberate care. A code, certainly. Do you observe the distribution, Watson?" I peered at the paper, but could make little sense of it. Dots and linesies, I see them, but they could be smudges to my untrained eye. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Smudges are rarely so evenly spaced. The question is, does our composer here write in the key of Morse, or in some less common tongue? He replaced the page carefully. "For now, we shall leave it as we found it. There is a language in silence, Inspector, and in the posture of the dead man as well." At this, he stepped to the organ bench and examined the worn wood where Hume's hands had last rested. He touched the keys lightly, producing a thin, ghostly chord that seemed to linger in the stillness of the church. Then he turned his attention to the floor, crouching to inspect the flagstones. "A scuff here," he said, "and another made by a heel dragging, not stepping." The man was seated, yet moved. That implies either a sudden weakness or a hand upon him. His gaze swept upward to the gallery, to the carved railings above. "And what lies behind that?" "The choir loft," Gregson replied, "locked at night. Holmes tapped his cane thoughtfully. Locks have been known to yield to more than keys. Come, let us see the rest. We followed Gregson to a small vestry at the side of the chancel, where a modest fire burned and the verger stooped. Gray-haired fellow named Mr. Pike waited to be questioned. He bowed respectfully to Holmes, but his lined face was pale. "It's not right, sir," he said, voice quavering. Mr. Hume was the soul of kindness. To find him so like he'd fallen asleep but wouldn't wake, he broke off. Shaking his head, Holmes questioned him gently. Extracting a few fragments of routine, Hume had been alone in the church the previous evening to rehearse for Sunday's service. Pike had locked the doors at 9 and returned at 6 that morning to open them, discovering the scene as described. He had heard no sound in the night, save perhaps a faint echo of music when passing on his way home, though he could not be sure it was from St. Anne's. When the verger was dismissed, Holmes lingered in the vestry, his gaze drawn to a shelf where hymnals were stacked in orderly rows. He plucked one at random, flipped through its pages, and then set it aside with an expression I had come to associate with the quiet. Confirmation of a private theory by the time we stepped back into the gray daylight. The fog had thickened so that the spire was half lost in vapor. Holmes drew his coat closer and looked down the street as though seeing something far beyond the present scene. "There is more music in this than meets the ear, Watson," he said at last. "A code within a hymn, a death without cause, and a witness who hears but does not see. I suspect the next note will be struck soon if we listen closely enough to catch it." I could not say whether it was the chill of the fog or the quiet certainty in his voice, but I felt then that the case was already taking on a shape that once revealed would be nothing short of astonishing. Chapter 3. The Silent Note Suite. Took luncheon in a small tea-room off Parliament Street. Holmes, speaking little and eating less, his eyes fixed on the rain-speckled window, as if the very pattern of the drops might yield some hidden truth. I had learned not to interrupt these stretches of concentrated thought, though Gregson's restlessness at our table was almost palpable. When at last Holmes stirred, it was only to produce from his pocket a folded scrap of paper, the rough sketch of the hymn sheet that I had seen him make in the vestry, and begin to jot small groups of dashes and dots beneath each line of music. His brow furrowed, the pen pausing now and again, as if the work before him were a delicate surgical operation. "Morse," he murmured once, almost to himself, though with irregular intervals. "Curious." Then, as if remembering our company, he slid the paper away and rose. "Gentlemen, we must return to Baker Street. There is more to be learned from this note than we can extract in a public dining room." Back at our familiar sitting room, Holmes set to work with a focus I had seen only in the most complex of his cases. From the bureau, he took a well-thumbed reference on cryptography, and with his violin bow resting idle in one hand and a pencil in the other, began matching the symbols to letters. The faint crackle of the fire was the only sound for nearly half an hour, until he pushed the paper away with a faint click of his tongue. "It is a message," he said, "but incomplete. Either the writer was interrupted, or this page is one of several. What we have reads only at the tolling, and then it breaks off. The rest is silence." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "What tolls in Westminster, Watson?" "The Abbey bells," I ventured. "Or perhaps, precisely, and when? That is the question. The bells may toll for service, for death, for commemoration. We must discover which the writer meant. Gregson shifted uneasily. If there are other pages, they may still be in the church. Perhaps, Holmes allowed, or perhaps the writer intended them for another set of eyes entirely. In that case, the hymn was a signal, and the one who was to read it will know by now that their message has gone astray. He glanced toward the window, where the afternoon light had grown dull and heavy. In which case, Inspector, we may expect movement from our unseen hand before the day is out. His words proved prophetic sooner than I anticipated. Shortly after 4 o'clock, a boy in a tattered cap arrived with a note. Its address to Mr. Hume, or the organ master of St. Anne's, scrawled in hurried ink. Gregson slit it open, but found only a blank sheet within. Holmes took it with evident interest, holding it to the lamp, then to the steam of the kettle, until faint letters bloomed in the paper's fibers. The tolling is delayed. Wait. Holmes's eyes gleamed. There we have confirmation. The message was indeed meant to be part of a series, and this sender, whoever they are, believes their recipient still lives. That gives us a slender advantage. He rose and began pacing, each step measured. Gregson, I should like you to station discreet men near St. Anne's tonight. Watson and I shall remain within easy reach. There is a tempo to these affairs, and I believe the next bar of the melody will be played after dark. That evening the fog thickened once more, wrapping the streets in a damp muffler. We waited in our rooms, Holmes at his violin, drawing out slow, wandering phrases that seemed to echo the uncertainty of the case. I confess I dozed by the fire, only to be roused by the sharp knock of Gregson at the door. Movement, Mr. Holmes, he reported. A shadow at the churchyard wall, slipping toward the vestry door. My men followed, but the figure vanished. We found the vestry unlocked, though Pike swears he secured it earlier. Holmes's face was unreadable as he donned his coat. Come, Watson. The third note of our hymn may have just been struck. We set out into the muffled dark, the lamps along the street hazy halos in the mist. St. Anne's loomed ahead, silent and dark save for the faintest glow from the vestry window. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp stone. Holmes moved swiftly to the organ, scanning the stand where the hymn page had lain. It was gone. For a moment no one spoke. Then Holmes bent, retrieving a small scrap of paper from beneath the bench. On it were more dots and dashes, and a single word, decipherable without effort, tonight. He turned to us with a look that was both grave and electric. The music quickens, gentlemen. We are no longer at the prelude. This is the opening of the true performance. Chapter 4. The gathering of voices. The choir met on Thursdays, and though the city's clocks had not yet struck 7, we found St. Anne's already rousing to life when we returned the next evening under clearer skies. A thin moon peered through the clear story, and candles pricked the nave with small islands of light. Holmes had sent ahead a message in Gregson's name, requesting that all persons connected with the music of the church attend for questions concerning Mr. Hume's death. It was a reasonable pretext, and the names that appeared one by one seemed to me a kind of litany. The vicar, the verger, the organ tuner, the soprano, the tenor, the benefactor. Holmes greeted each in turn with the same cool civility, his eye missing nothing, his voice calm as still water. At dusk, the Reverend Arthur Merriweather, vicar of St. Anne's. was a well-fed man, with mild features and the uneasy polish of one accustomed to committees. He pressed Holmes's hand with a tremor he tried to conceal, and murmured that this tragedy was a visitation no parish ought to endure. Behind him hovered the verger, Mr. Pike, his anxious fingers pleating his cap. The two made a strange pair, the one plump and perfumed, the other sharp and gray as a winter sparrow. Holmes gave them little more than a nod, and turned as a woman's voice drifted up the aisle low, warm and trained. "Mrs. Lydia Harrow," Gregson whispered at my shoulder, consulting the list. "Principal soprano." She might have been 36, with steady eyes and a carriage that spoke of discipline. There was grace in her movements and a hint of iron in the set of her mouth. She bowed to the vicar, accepted the verger's, murmured sympathy with a flick of the lashes, and watched Holmes as one might watch a surgeon laying out his instruments. A step behind her came Basil Cotter, the first tenor, a narrow-faced young man with nervous hands and a habit of moistening his lips before he spoke. He carried his music under his arm as if it might fly away if not held firmly. Silas Webb, the organ tuner, arrived next, a gaunt fellow in a shiny black coat, his hair cropped close, his eyes pale and quick as a weasel's. He bore a leather case that clinked faintly when he set it down, tuning forks, I supposed, or small tools for the mechanism. "Bad business, gentlemen," he said, without preface, the words scraping in his throat. "Bad for the lungs. 2 churches are damp." He sniffed as if to prove it, and looked toward the gallery, where the organ pipes lifted their mute ranks into the gloom. The last to come was Sir Julius Rathbone, a parish benefactor whose name I had heard in connection with charitable endowments. He was a florid, heavy gentleman with a gold-headed stick and a certain impatience in his step, as though the world moved a degree too slowly for his comfort. Holmes suggested we repair to the vestry, where 2 chairs had been set near the small fire and a third left conspicuously free. He did not take it, but stood by the mantel, his hands clasped behind him. "We are grateful for your assistance," he began, his voice carrying easily in the little room. "You all knew Mr. Hume. It is the habit of tragedy to make the living speak where the dead cannot, and I must therefore ask you to indulge me with a few questions." He let the smallest pause accumulate. "We shall proceed simply. Your last knowledge of Mr. Hume on the evening before his death, and anything of note in his conduct these past weeks." The vicar went first, slowly, as if climbing a stair in the dark. "Hume had served the parish with devotion," he said, "and had lately been absorbed in revising the Easter program. There had been no quarrels, no difficulties beyond the usual wrangles of taste. He was reserve itself," Merryweather concluded, and folded his hands like a man closing a book. Holmes asked gently whether the church had been kept locked that night. The vicar deferred to the verger, who, clearing his throat, affirmed that he had turned the keys at 9 and left Mr. Hume alone at the organ. "He said he would only be an hour," Pike added, with a quick glance at Mrs. Harrow for the voluntaries. Lydia Harrow's gaze did not shift. "Mr. Hume was exacting," she said, "but he was never unjust. He had lately altered the arrangement for Abide with Me. I thought it overwrought. So he smiled and said the text would bear the weight. That was all." She paused, and then, in a voice that had a thread of steel, "I will add that a woman who sings here is not a servant to be ordered about at whim. Mr. Hume knew that." Basil Cotter colored slightly and stared at the hearth. When invited, he confessed that he had missed the last rehearsal, owing, he said, to a cold. Mrs. Harrow's eyebrow twitched as if she doubted the malady. Holmes did not press him, only remarked that the air would indeed trouble a throat if one were careless with it. Silas Webb, for his part, claimed to have seen Hume twice in the fortnight, once to attend a sticky pedal, and again, the day before the tragedy, to regulate a cipher in the swell. A note that speaks when it oughtn't, he explained with a dry little smile. You put your hand on the stop, and she whispers without asking. Hume had been courteous but distracted, he said, and had asked Webb to leave the upper actuation a shade lighter than usual. Said his touch wanted feathering. Holmes's eyes flickered at that, and he asked the tuner to describe which pipes had been affected. Webb obliged readily, and though the detail escaped me, it seemed to satisfy Holmes that the man knew his business. Sir Julius tapped his stick against his boot and declared himself at a loss to imagine a motive for violence in a church. He spoke of endowments and the duty of art to uplift the poor, and made a point of saying that he, for one, resented any suggestion that St. Anne's was lax in its care for property. We have had thefts in other parishes, he said, but here we maintain standards. Holmes inclined his head and asked whether Sir Julius had any recent correspondence with Mr. Hume regarding funds or commissions. The baronet frowned, as if the question were in poor taste, then conceded that Hume had declined a suggested organ recital for a charitable fete. He said it would cheapen sacred music, Sir Julius muttered, as though the phrase had stung him. Holmes let the room breathe. Then, as if the thought had only just occurred, he asked whether any of them had heard music late that night. It was the verger who answered first no, save for a faint echo on his way home, which might have been any parish warming its pipes. Mrs. Harrow said she had slept poorly and heard only her own clock. Basil, that he had dosed himself with syrup and could not swear to any sound. The vicar, that the wind had been busy among the gutters. Silas Webb lifted a shoulder. If the swell had a cipher, she'd murmur till morning. But I'd set her right in the afternoon. Sir Julius expressed a vague irritation with London noises in general. To each reply, Holmes offered a small nod, as though each pebble cast into the pool made a ring that interested him. At length he dismissed them to the nave, saying that Gregson might need a word after their practice. But before they filed out, he detained Mrs. Harrow with a question so casual it might have been idle courtesy. You mentioned the altered arrangement for Abide With Me, madam. Do you recall whether Mr. Hume annotated only the harmony or the melody as well? She met his gaze without flinching. He wrote a second line beneath the soprano, lightly in pencil. It was not for performance, he said, but for his own ear. I thought it needless. Holmes thanked her, and the soprano passed into the aisle with a glance that I could not read. We stood for a moment in the hush that follows the closing of a door. Holmes turned to the vicar. Might we step to the gallery, Mr. Merrill? I should like to examine the organ in your company. The vicar agreed at once, and we mounted the narrow stair, the stone worn to a shallow scoop by generations of feet. The organ bench stood as it had on the morning of the death. Though the hymn book upon the stand was different, another copy of the same volume, its binding less frayed. Holmes's fingers wandered over the manuals without sound, testing resistance. Lightened, as Webb said, he murmured. "A feather's weight will call the voice." He lifted the fall-board and glanced at the dust upon its inner lip, then at the small brass plate that bore the builder's name. His eye drifted to a pencil stub tucked in a notch, and to a faint smudge along the edge of the rack where loose sheets might rest. "Curious," he said softly. "The small things are faithful when men are not. Watson, observe the faint arc upon the wood there, by the music ledge. Something thin was slid here and taken again several times in the same sweep." The vicar bent close and professed himself blind to it, which was no wonder, for the mark was slight as breath. Holmes straightened, and his gaze traveled along the pipe shades to the choir loft beyond, where two small chairs stood near a rail. One had a cushion depressed more deeply than the other. He said nothing of it, but I saw his nostrils flare, as if some scent in the woodwork had spoken to him when we descended. The choir had begun a warm-up, the sopranos spinning a line that hung like a thread of glass in the high air. Holmes stood by the west end, listening with half-closed eyes. At a sign from Mrs. Harrow, they turned to abide with me. The opening bars unfurled with grave simplicity, and for a moment the church seemed to breathe. But then there was the smallest hitch, as the tenors entered a fraction late, and Basil Cotter took his cue with a start, his voice catching as though surprised from a thought. Mrs. Harrow's head did not turn, but the muscle in her cheek tightened. Holmes watched, and a slow contentment, like the first shape of an answer, passed over his face and was gone. Practice broke. Gregson, who had been lingering near the south aisle, came to us with a note of eagerness. "Well?" he asked in a low voice. Holmes's reply was mild. "The choir is competent. The organ is sensitive. The reverberation time of this nave is 2½ seconds at most. A late entry offends more in a small space than a large. Mr. Cotter would do well to count with his eyes as well as his ears." Gregson looked puzzled by this musical arithmetic, but Holmes had already turned away toward the vestry door. "Inspector, keep your men upon the churchyard after dark. Our correspondent, who writes with steam upon paper, may prefer stone for his replies. And, Watson," he added, as we stepped once more into the cool passage, "do not neglect to notice who does not look at what everyone else is pretending to see." It was an oracular remark of the kind that both exasperated and reassured me. He had begun to hear the inner melody, I could tell, though he would not yet hum it aloud. Outside twilight rested upon the roofs, and the first bell from the abbey told the hour with a sober weight. Holmes listened until the sound dwindled. At the tolling, he repeated, very low, "Words are chosen for their edges. Tonight we must be ready when the edge is turned." Chapter 5. The first suspecta. Next morning dawned cold and pale. The sky a faint wash of gray that promised rain before noon. Holmes was unusually silent as we left Baker Street, his long coat drawn tight against the wind, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Our destination was the modest lodging of Basil Cotter. The tenor who stumbled during rehearsal had caught Holmes's keen attention. Gregson accompanied us, though his step was heavier with impatience. Eager to close the case now that a lead had presented itself, Cotter lived in a cramped flat above a grocer's shop in a narrow street of Clockenwell. The room he answered in was sparse and smelled faintly of cough syrup and cold peat smoke. He greeted us with a nervous smile, his fingers twitching against the worn arm of his chair, as though expecting a reprimand. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Cotter," he began, "you missed rehearsal on the day before Mr. Hume's death. Is that correct?" The young man swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir." I caught a chill and thought it best not to strain my voice. Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Yet you were well enough to attend the choir practice the very next evening." "Yes," Basil said quickly. "I felt better by then, though my throat was still sore." Gregson stepped forward. "And can anyone confirm your whereabouts during the evening Mr. Hume was found?" Cotter's eyes flicked toward the window, as if hoping to escape scrutiny. "I was at home, mostly resting." Holmes's voice was calm, but carried the weight of a subtle accusation. "Alone?" "Yes, alone." I noted the slight tremor in his hands, and wondered if it was fear or guilt that made them shake. Holmes allowed a moment of silence to settle, then asked, "Have you ever been in disagreement with Mr. Hume?" Cotter's lips pressed into a thin line. He was demanding yes. Some of his changes to the hymns, he hesitated, then added, "I did not agree with all of them, but no more than usual." Holmes inclined his head thoughtfully. "Did you know of anyone who might wish Mr. Hume ill?" The tenor's gaze dropped. "I cannot say." Our questioning was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. A woman entered plain, with sharp eyes and a steady step. "I'm Miss Emily Parks, a friend of Basil's," she said firmly. "He's told me about this inquiry, and I came to see if he needed assistance." Carriage's voice was steady. "Not superstition, Inspector. A deliberate distortion encoded to mislead or silence. Mr. Hume discovered it and paid the price." Holmes nodded slowly. "We shall see if your words hold the tune of truth, Mr. Carriage." As the man was taken into custody for further questioning, I watched Holmes's expression calm, but with an edge of urgency. The case was deepening, the melody growing more complex. Somewhere within these layers of coded notes and veiled threats lay the key to the impossible crime. Holmes turned to me as we left the Abbey grounds. "Tomorrow, Watson, we listen not only to the music, but to the silences between. The secret is seldom in the loudest note, but in the quiet pause that follows." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The morning that followed was heavy with rain, the kind that seeps into the bones and blurs the edges of thought. Holmes seemed unsettled, pacing the room with restless energy, his mind evidently weaving unseen patterns as the fire sputtered low in the grate. I noted the tension in his movements, an ease that bespoke not confusion, but the discomfort of a new and unexpected development. Our visitor from the night before, Thomas Carriage, sat quietly in the corner, guarded by a wary officer of Scotland Yard. He spoke little, his eyes shadowed beneath heavy brows, but Holmes treated him with a mixture of skepticism and measured respect. "You say Mr. Hume feared a corruption within the music," Holmes mused. "Something deliberate, something designed to deceive. Explain yourself fully, Mr. Carriage." The scholar's voice was calm, but edged with urgency. "Mr. Hume and I corresponded over a theory that within certain arrangements lay hidden messages, not merely codes, but instructions. I warned him it was dangerous to probe too deeply. There are those who would silence such knowledge." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you believe the altered hymn was a warning?" "A warning, yes, but perhaps also a lure, to draw attention away from the true cause." Carriage's gaze sharpened. "I had reason to fear for my own safety after Mr. Hume's death. I came to you because I see in you the only man with the insight to unravel this tangled score. Gregson frowned, unconvinced. A scholar caught up in church gossip, hardly a suspect for murder. Holmes smiled thinly. Not a suspect, Inspector, but certainly a person of interest. Our conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. A messenger entered with a telegram, delivered with a haste that suggested urgency. Holmes took it and read the brief note silently, his face unreadable. The verger, Mr. Pike, has vanished. The room fell into stunned silence. Vanished, I echoed. Holmes nodded. Disappeared without trace, just as the shadows lengthened last night. Gregson swore under his breath. A missing witness. This complicates matters. Without hesitation, Holmes rose. Indeed, we must pay a visit to the verger's lodgings immediately. The rain had ceased, but the streets were slick and glistening as we hurried to a modest lodging in a side street near the church. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the room was in disrepairs, scattered, furniture overturned, and a faint scent of tobacco smoke lingering in the air. Holmes moved swiftly, examining the room with his customary precision. A struggle, perhaps, or a hurried departure. Gregson crouched by the window. The latch was forced. Holmes nodded grimly. Our verger left in haste or was taken. Either is cause for grave concern. Among the scattered papers, Holmes found a torn fragment of a letter. The ink smudged, but still legible enough to read. Must meet tonight. The truth hides beneath the silence. Trust none but those who understand the hymn. He folded the paper carefully. The verger, like Mr. Hume, was privy to the secret messages hidden in the music. Then we are dealing with a conspiracy, Gregson said darkly. Men who fear exposure. Holmes was silent for a moment before speaking again. Yes, but of what kind? And how deep does it run? The weight of those questions hung heavy in the air as we left the abandoned room. The city's distant bells tolling a slow, mournful dirge. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat at his desk, his eyes distant as he pieced together the fragments of this strange puzzle. The disappearance of the verger changes the tempo of our investigation, he said at last. We are no longer merely observers, but participants in a dangerous dance. I watched him closely, sensing the gravity of the moment. The case had shifted. What had begun as a mysterious death in a quiet church had evolved into a tangled web of secrets, coded messages, and vanished men. The music we sought to understand was no longer confined to hymns and organs. It echoed in the shadows and whispered through the streets of London itself. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers once more. Tomorrow we follow the notes to their source, and we must do so with care, for the melody may yet turn deadly. I nodded, feeling the chill of anticipation settle over me. The crime was growing stranger by the hour, and the path to truth was dark and uncertain. Yet I knew, as always, that Holmes would follow it wherever it led Devon, into the heart of silence itself. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The morning air was crisp and clear, a welcome contrast to the damp gloom that had lingered over London these past days. Yet, within the walls of 2-1B Baker Street, a different kind of chill had settled, a tense stillness that presaged a turning point in our investigation. Holmes was restless, his usual calm replaced by an eager intensity, as though he sought to unravel the final threads binding this perplexing mystery before they frayed beyond hope. "I believe, Watson," he began, glancing up from the scattered papers and coded notes that littered the desk, "that our suspect is not merely hiding a secret, but is actively attempting to manipulate those around him. A psychological game designed to sow confusion and divert attention from the true nature of the crime." Gregson, who had joined us early that day, frowned. "And what's your plan to unmask this puppeteer?" Holmes's eyes sparkled with a rare amusement. "We become the players in his game, Inspector. By provoking reactions through calculated provocations, we shall observe the subtle tells that betray guilt." With that, Holmes set about orchestrating a series of encounters designed to unsettle the suspects, beginning with a carefully crafted letter addressed to Mrs. Lydia Harrow. The letter, written in an elegant hand and unsigned, contained a cryptic reference to the hidden messages within "Abide with me," and hinted at knowledge of her disagreement with Mr. Hume. We delivered the letter discreetly, ensuring it reached her before the evening rehearsal. Holmes was keen to observe her reaction, believing that fear or anxiety might provoke a slip that would reveal her deeper involvement. That evening, the church was filled with the low murmur of the choir warming their voices, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the stone walls. Holmes stood in the nave, his figure barely visible in the gloom, while I took my usual place near the organ bench. Mrs. Harrow arrived with her customary grace, but I noted a subtle stiffness in her manner as she glanced toward the pew where the letter had been placed. Throughout rehearsal, Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon her, as though reading the silent language of her every movement. When a minor discord arose between the sopranos and tenors, Holmes raised his hand slightly, halting the music, and spoke softly but clearly. "The melody of truth is often drowned beneath a cloak of discord. Miss Harrow, would you care to explain why your voice falters when the tenor stumbles?" The soprano's gaze flicked to Basil Cotter, whose face had gone pale. "I did not falter," she said, though her voice wavered. Holmes pressed on. "Yet your eyes betray a hesitation, a discord not found in the notes. You and Mr. Cotter are allies, are you not?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We have been close for some time." Gregson stepped forward. "Then why the quarrel over Mr. Hume's arrangements?" Mrs. Harrow's posture stiffened, but she replied evenly, "It was a matter of artistic interpretation, nothing more." Holmes, however, was not satisfied. In the quiet moments between pieces, he began a subtle campaign of comments aimed to unsettle, questions posed with double meanings, casual observations dropped like seeds meant to grow doubt. At one point, he mentioned aloud, "It is curious how a single altered note can change the entire harmony. Yet, sometimes, the smallest alteration conceals the deepest betrayal." Mrs. Harrow's fingers tightened on her music folder, but she said nothing. Holmes continued, watching her carefully. Later, as the choir dispersed, Holmes engaged Basil Cotter in conversation, his tone light but probing. "Mr. Cotter, I hear your voice carries not only notes but secrets. Tell me, do you find the altered hymn difficult to reconcile with your own conscience?" Cotter flushed, but met Holmes's gaze. "I respect Mr. Hume's wishes, sir, though I admit I had reservations, and those reservations," Holmes's voice was almost a whisper. "Merely that some changes are better left unspoken," Cotter said, then hurried away before more could be said. As the evening drew to a close, Holmes gathered us near the organ bench and spoke quietly. "Both Mrs. Harrow and Mr. Cotter show signs of tension and emotional dissonance that could signify guilt or fear. Yet it is not enough to accuse without proof." He turned to Gregson. "We must now observe their behavior beyond these walls, where the masks of performance fall away. I have arranged for discreet surveillance of both." Gregson nodded. "We will keep watch and report any unusual movements." Holmes's gaze lingered on the dimly lit organ pipes. "Remember, Watson, a mind bent on deception is often betrayed by the smallest crack. We seek that fracture, and when we find it, the entire structure will crumble." The game was afoot, and in this delicate dance of shadows and secrets, Holmes had taken the lead. We waited, poised on the edge of revelation, listening not only to the notes sung aloud, but to the silences that carried the weight of hidden truths. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The night had fallen thick and heavy when the news arrived. An urgent message from Gregson, summoning Holmes and me back to the church without delay. The streets were slick with recent rain, and the lamps cast trembling pools of light upon the cobblestones as we hurried through the quiet city. There was a tension in the air, a quiet foreboding that pressed upon the senses like a shadow too large to ignore. At St. Anne's the scene was charged with nervous energy. Scotland Yard officers had cordoned off the area around the vestry, where a fresh disturbance had been reported. The verger's room, which only days before had been ransacked, was once again the center of unrest. This time, however, the destruction was more deliberate: papers shredded, drawers overturned, and, most chilling of all, a message scrawled hastily upon the wall in ink. "The song is not yet finished." Holmes examined the writing with his usual care, tracing the letters as if reading a living script. "A warning, Watson," he said quietly. "The culprit is no longer content to hide in shadows. He or she is daring us to follow." Gregson approached. "A witness reports seeing a figure near the churchyard walls just before the break-in. The man was cloaked, face obscured, and disappeared into the mist." Holmes nodded slowly. "The same figure, perhaps, who moved at midnight beneath the clock." The church itself seemed to hold its breath as we ventured inside. The organ, silent and dark, loomed over us like a sleeping beast. Holmes's gaze lingered on the bench, now bare save for scattered fragments of sheet music. He bent to retrieve a small, crumpled piece of paper half hidden beneath the petals. The scrawl upon it was hurried but unmistakable. "Tonight's toll will strike twice." I felt a cold shiver creep down my spine. "A threat?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed with fierce resolve. "More than that, Watson. An announcement. Our adversary intends another move, and soon. We must be prepared." The hours that followed were tense and watchful. Holmes and I took our posts near the churchyard gates, while Gregson coordinated patrols around the perimeter. The city seemed hushed, as if it too anticipated the unfolding drama. At nearly midnight, the bells of Westminster began their slow, resonant tolling. Each sonorous clang echoed through the mist, a solemn call that reverberated against the ancient stones. Holmes's eyes were fixed on the shadowed path beneath the clock tower, his posture taut with expectation. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog, a slender form, moving swiftly, purposefully. It was Basil Cotter, clutching a small parcel to his chest. Holmes and I exchanged a glance, but said nothing, watching as the young man disappeared beneath the archway at the tower's base. Moments later, a second figure appeared, this one cloaked and hooded, moving with equal urgency. Holmes stepped forward, his voice a clear command, cutting through the stillness. "Halt!" The stranger froze, then turned slowly. Under the hood, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Lydia Harrow's face, pale but determined. She held a small book, its cover worn and familiar. Holmes advanced. "Miss Harrow, what business brings you here at this hour?" She met his gaze steadily. "I came to deliver a message, one that may save a life." Before more could be said, a sudden cry pierced the night, a sharp, strangled sound from the shadows beyond. Both Cotter and Mrs. Harrow spun toward the noise, their faces etched with alarm. From the darkness emerged a figure, tall, gaunt, and unmistakably familiar. It was Thomas Courage, clutching at his chest, his breath ragged. Behind him, the hooded stranger vanished into the mist. Holmes was upon Carriage in an instant. "What happened?" Carriage gasped, an attempt to silence me. "The message is more dangerous than we thought." As we helped the scholar inside, Holmes's expression hardened. "Our adversary grows desperate." He looked toward Cotter and Harrow. "And all three of you are now players in a deadly game." The night's events cast a new shadow over the case. The impossible crime had become a dance of threats and narrow escapes, the music of murder growing ever more urgent and complex. Holmes's mind raced to keep pace with the shifting rhythms, knowing that the next note could bring revelation or ruin. As dawn broke, I saw the familiar firelight in Holmes's eyes, the spark of a man who thrives on mystery and danger alike. The case was far from over, and in the silence between the tolls, the truth awaited its final unveiling. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The early morning light filtered through the curtains of 221B Baker Street with a pale and hesitant glow, as if even the sun itself was cautious about what the day might reveal. Holmes sat by the window, his gaze distant and unfocused, fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on the arm of his chair. The events of the night had unsettled him, yet there was a gleam in his eyes, the flicker of a mind closing in on its quarry. "It is not merely the cryptic notes or the vanished verdure that demand our attention, Watson," he said softly, breaking the silence. "The true motive lies deeper, concealed beneath layers of music and misdirection." I leaned forward, eager for the insight I knew would come. "What is it, Holmes? What have you uncovered?" He reached for the scattered documents on his desk and spread before me a series of letters, correspondence between Mr. Hume and an unknown recipient, written in a careful, looping hand. The letters spoke of financial troubles, disputes over the church's endowment, and, most intriguingly, a veiled reference to an ancient manuscript believed to contain sacred knowledge, hidden within the music of St. Anne's. Holmes's voice was grave. The music was more than a code. It was a map, a guide to a secret that, if revealed, would append the very foundation of this parish. I stared at the letters, the weight of their implications settling like a stone in my stomach. A secret worth killing for. Precisely. Holmes's eyes flashed with determination. Mr. Hume had discovered that certain hymns contained alterations deliberate and subtlement to conceal the location of a ledger, one that documented illicit transactions involving the church's benefactors. Gregson, who had joined us, frowned. "Are you suggesting a conspiracy?" Holmes nodded. "Not merely a conspiracy, but a betrayal of trust on a grand scale. The benefactors, including Sir Julius Rathbone, stand to lose much if the ledger sees the light of day." I recalled Sir Julius's sharp-wise dismissal of the choir's troubles, and his evident irritation when Mr. Hume declined to perform at the charity event. It seemed the benefactor had reasons to silence the choir master. Holmes continued. "Our missing verger, Mr. Pike, was likely the keeper of this secreter, gatekeeper between the music and the truth. His disappearance is no accident." A knock at the door interrupted us. A messenger handed Holmes a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was an old, leather-bound book, the very manuscript mentioned in the letters. Its pages were yellowed with age, inscribed with musical notations, alongside cryptic annotations. Holmes traced a finger over the faded ink. "This manuscript contains the ledger's cipher. The alterations in Abide With Me and other hymns are keys to unlock its secrets." The implications were staggering. The case was no longer about a single murder, but about the fate of a community and the hidden sins of those entrusted with its care. Holmes stood, his expression resolute. "We must confront the benefactors. Their silence is the final barrier between us and the truth." As we prepared to leave, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The mystery was unraveling, and the music that had once seemed so gentle now thundered with the weight of betrayal and greed. The true motive had surfaced, and with it the shadow of justice waiting to fall. The dawn broke quietly over Baker Street, the city still shrouded in a pale mist that blurred the edges of chimneys and rooftops like a faded watercolor. Within the warm confines of our sitting room, Holmes was absorbed in his reflections, the firelight casting flickering patterns upon his thoughtful face. The night's revelations had unsettled many, but for Holmes, they were the first clear notes in a complex symphony finally beginning to resolve. "Watson," he began, voice low and deliberate, "the threads we have gathered reveal more than mere misappropriation or petty grievance. There is a deeper current, one that runs through faith, power, and the human heart's darkest yearnings." I leaned forward, eager to understand. "What have you uncovered, Holmes?" He tapped a parchment strewn with letters and ciphered notes. "Mr. Hume's correspondence alludes to an ancient manuscript, a ledger hidden not simply as a record of transactions, but as a mappa guide to secrets guarded jealously by those who wield influence in the parish." Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. The ledger exposed not just financial corruption, but a betrayal of sacred trust. Those entrusted with stewardship manipulated the church's resources, bending faith to their will for personal gain. I recalled the genteel yet cold demeanor of Sir Julius Rathbone, the parish's principal benefactor. Holmes continued. Sir Julius's reluctance to have Mr. Hume perform at the charity event was more than mere pride, was a calculated effort to silence a man who threatened to unravel the carefully constructed facade. The ledger itself was no ordinary record. It bore cryptic annotations and coded entries, revealing a network of collusion and intimidation that spanned years. The disappearance of the verger, Pike, now took on new significance as the keeper of these secrets. Holmes stood and began pacing, his steps slow but purposeful. The true motive behind these crimes was to protect this ledger, the tangible proof of a betrayal that would shake the parish to its core. He paused, then held out a small, weathered book we had recently recovered. Within these pages lies the cipher to the ledger, and with it, the final pieces of the puzzle. The realization settled heavily upon us. The case was not merely a question of who had killed Mr. Hume, but why a tale of faith twisted by greed, and of music used as both a shield and a sword. Holmes's voice softened. The motive is revealed not in a single act, but in the slow corrosion of trust, the betrayal that comes not with a shout, but with a whisper beneath sacred hymns. As the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, I understood that the melody of this case was far from simple. Its themes were layered with human frailty, ambition, and the eternal struggle between truth and concealment. Holmes looked to the window, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "We stand now on the brink of the final act, Watson. Justice must be served, but the path to it is fraught with shadows." I nodded, knowing that whatever lay ahead, Holmes's keen mind would guide us through the lingering darkness toward the dawn of truth. The case had grown deeper, stranger, and infinitely more perilous, and I was ready to follow him into its heart. Grand strategy. The drawing room at Sir Julius Rathbone's residence was a study in restrained opulence, its heavy curtains drawn against the evening chill and the flicker of candlelight, casting dancing shadows upon the polished wood and gilded frames. Holmes moved through the room with a quiet purpose, his gaze steady upon the assembled figures. Sir Julius himself, Lydia Harrow, Basil Cotter, and Reverend Merriweather. Each bore the weight of unease beneath their formal composure, as if anticipating the unraveling of some carefully woven tapestry. Holmes took his place near the hearth, his manner calm yet commanding. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, "we are gathered because the music of St. Anne's has been marred by more than discordant notes. A secret ledger, hidden within the sacred hymns, has been the cause of grave injury and silence." Sir Julius's face tightened. "This is a most serious accusation, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "Serious indeed, Sir Julius, and one that requires truth to be sung aloud." He reached into his coat and produced a letter, one bearing the peculiar script that had confounded us for days. "This letter, and the manuscript you know so well, hold the key to the ledger's location." He allowed a moment's silence to settle, then spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Hume discovered the ledger's existence and sought to reveal the corruption it contained. For this, he was silenced. Our verger, Mr. Pike, held the knowledge of where the ledger is hidden, but he, too, has vanished." Lydia Harrow exchanged a glance with Basil Cotter, the tension between them palpable. Holmes's eyes flicked between the pair. "I understand your involvement in the choir brought you close to these secrets. Your fear and reticence are understandable, but fear cannot protect the guilty." Reverend Merriweather stepped forward, his expression troubled. "If such corruption exists within our parish, it must be exposed. The truth will bring healing." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Healing requires courage, Reverend, and those who seek to silence the truth must be confronted." He then unveiled his grand strategy. "Tonight we shall stage a final performancer, gathering orchestrated to draw forth the keeper of the ledger and those who wish it hidden, by sending a false message, crafted to mimic the secret code. We will bait the adversary into revealing themselves." Gregson nodded. "A trap, then." "Precisely." Holmes smiled faintly. "And I shall take a role within the chorus, disguised to observe without suspicion. Watson, you will be my witness and aid." The evening was charged with anticipation as we prepared for the performance. Holmes's disguise was impeccable, simple cloak and cap, his face partially shadowed, but eyes keen and alert. The false message had been delivered to the church under cover of night, a carefully coded summons promising the ledger's retrieval at the stroke of midnight. The choir gathered, their voices rising in the familiar strains of "Abide with Me," each note weighted with unspoken meaning. Holmes and I stood among the congregation, our eyes searching the shadows for signs of movement. As the clock told midnight, a figure slipped silently through the nave, slim, cloaked, cautious. Holmes's hand tightened on mine. The figure moved toward the organ, fingers trembling as they reached for a concealed panel beneath the keys. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A hand seized the figure's arm, and a low struggle ensued. Holmes sprang forward, revealing himself and commanding the attacker to cease. The man hesitated, then slumped in surrender. A known associate of Sir Julius, charged with safeguarding the ledger's secret. Holmes's voice rang out, clear and resolute. "The game is over. The ledger is found, and the silence will be broken." The room seemed to hold its breath as officers moved to secure the prisoner. Holmes turned to the assembled choir and benefactors, his eyes blazing. "Tonight, the truth has sung its final note, and justice will follow." I felt a surge of relief and admiration. The trap had worked perfectly, drawing the conspirators from their hiding and revealing the dark heart beneath the hymn. Yet, I knew this was but a chapter's end. There remained questions to be answered and consequences to face. Holmes's plan had unfolded with brilliant precision, and as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I understood that the music of St. Anne's had changed forever. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. Holmes sat quietly in the dim glow of our Baker Street sitting room, the weight of the past day's revelations pressing heavily upon the air between us. His eyes were fixed not on the flickering fire, but on a faded scrap of parchment resting on his knee, a fragment torn from the ledger we had recovered from beneath the organ's secret panel. The cryptic annotations and faded ink seemed to stir some deep chamber in his mind, awakening the final pieces of a puzzle that had danced just beyond reach. "Watson," he began softly, voice low and measured, "the case has taught us much about deception and concealment. But it has also revealed the power of silence, what is not said, as much as what is. The ledger exposed the corruption at the heart of St. Anne's, yet the true revelation lies in the motive that drove the conspirators to murder." I leaned forward, eager to hear the culmination of his thoughts. "Pray, Holmes, what is this motive?" He paused, as if weighing each word. "At first, we were drawn to the obvious, the misappropriation of funds, the greed of those entrusted with stewardship. But the ledger is more than a mere account of monetary transactions. It contains references to a cherished tradition, a doctrine of sacred music handed down through generations, which these men sought to control and protect at any cost. Holmes's finger traced a line of faint musical notes beside an annotation in a hand I recognized as Sir Julius Rathbone's. These men believed the music itself to be holy, a divine inheritance. They feared that exposure of their deeds would not only disgrace them, but desecrate the sanctity of that inheritance. I pondered the weight of such belief. So they killed to protect a secret sacred to them. Exactly. And it is here, Holmes said, tapping the ledger, that the true crime takes shape. The betrayal was not only of parishioners' trust, but of faith itself, its sacrilege masked by the guise of devotion. He rose suddenly, the firelight casting a flicker across his determined face. But there is one final piece, the identity of the mastermind behind the scheme. A figure who moved behind the scenes, manipulating events with a careful hand. He turned to the window, the pale dawn spilling in and catching the gleam in his eyes. It was the vicar, Reverend Merriweather. I blinked in surprise. The vicar. Holmes nodded. A man of mild demeanor, yet with a will steeled by conviction. He stood to lose the most, should the ledger be revealed, not only his reputation, but his very position. Holmes explained that he had noted subtle inconsistencies in the Reverend's statements. The way his gaze faltered when questioned about the church's finances, and the curious timing of his absences during key moments. The ledger had been both a weapon and a shield in his hands, a tool to maintain control under the cloak of sanctity. And the message, I asked, the coded notes, the vanished verger, the attempts to silence others, all orchestrated to conceal the ledger's location and to protect the Reverend's secret. At that moment, the door opened softly, and Gregson entered, carrying Reverend Merriweather in custody. The man's face was pale, his composure shaken but defiant. Holmes approached him calmly. "Reverend, your devotion has blinded you to justice. It is time to answer for your deeds." Merriweather's eyes met Holmes's with a mixture of regret and resolve. "I acted to protect the church," he murmured. "Would you condemn that?" Holmes's reply was quiet but firm. "The church is not a sanctuary for crime, but a beacon for truth." As Merriweather was led away, I glanced at Holmes, whose expression was one of quiet triumph tinged with sorrow. The final piece had fallen into place, revealing the true depth of the Crema tragedy, born not merely of greed, but of misguided piety. The case was at last solved, yet the echoes of its melody would linger long in the shadows of St. Anne's, a reminder that even the purest hymns can carry the darkest secrets. The stillness of Baker Street's sitting room was broken only by the slow, measured ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of embers in the hearth. Holmes sat quietly, his eyes cast downward, tracing the faded lines of the aged manuscript before him. The candlelight flickered, casting restless shadows that danced like spectral whispers upon the walls. An appropriate accompaniment to the heavy silence that hung like a veil between us. "Watson," Holmes began, voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp with intensity. "The game has unfolded in ways both expected and bewildering, yet at last the final note begins to sound." I leaned closer, heart quickening with anticipation. "What have you discovered, Holmes? What hidden truth lies beneath the ciphered hymn and the vanished witnesses?" His gaze lifted slowly, meeting mine with an expression that was at once triumphant and contemplative. The answer was concealed not only within the music, but embedded in the very fabric of human frailty and greed. The faintest mark so easily overlooked concealed a key that unlocked the entire mystery. He extended the manuscript toward me. The faded pencil annotations traced the melody of "Abide with me." Yet it was the subtle arrangement of marks along the margins that drew my attention, a pattern of dots and lines. Irregular but deliberate, Holmes's finger traced a diagonal line that ran through the lyrics, forming a sequence of letters. "Observe," he said, "an acrostic cipher, where the initial letters of each phrase form the name of one who believed himself beyond suspicion." My breath caught. Sir Julius Rathbone. Holmes inclined his head solemnly. The benefactor's hand is unmistakable. His influence permeated the parish like a shadow, silent yet suffocating. But the revelation deepened. Beneath the name lay a data reference to a prior scandal involving the theft of parish funds, a thread that wove a tapestry of deceit far wider than we had imagined. The ledger was but one leaf in a tome of corruption stretching across years and parishes. Holmes's voice grew grave. The ledger chronicles not just misdeeds, but a betrayal of sacred trust concealed beneath a veneer of piety. The murder of Mr. Hume and the disappearance of the verger were acts of desperation, attempts to silence truth before it could sing. He paused, as if weighing the weight of the confession he now held. Yet it was the ledger's final secret that shattered the conspiracy, the handwritten confession of Sir Julius himself. Breaking the seal of a folded letter, Holmes read aloud the scrawled words of guilt and remorse, penned with a trembling hand. The benefactor admitted to orchestrating threats, manipulating parishioners, and silencing opposition, all in the name of preserving a fragile dominion of power. The melody of his guilt resonates through these pages, Holmes mused. It is a dirge for a soul lost to ambition. I felt a chill pass through me. The very music we revered had been weaponized against its purpose to cloak lies and conceal murder. Holmes folded the letter carefully and looked toward the window where dawn's first light spilled over the city rooftops. Justice has a rhythm all its own, Watson. It is not always swift, nor is it always loud. Often it whispers in the spaces between notes, awaiting a listener who knows where to hear. His eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. The final note has sounded, but its echoes will linger long in the halls of St. Anne's and in the conscience of those who heard it. There was a pause, a breath held in the quiet of the room before Holmes rose and stretched. "Come, Watson, the day beckons. We have truth to lay before the court and shadows to dispel." As we prepared, I reflected on the profound journey we had undertaken, from a single cryptic note to the unveiling of a conspiracy that threatened the very soul of a parish. It was a case that would haunt me, not for its darkness, but for the delicate interplay of light and shadow that defined all human endeavor. The manuscript lay on the table, its secrets laid bare, but its melody forever changed. The note hidden in the hymn had been found, and with it, a reminder that beneath the quietest music, the deepest mysteries often dwell. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape the first gray light of dawn crept through the heavy drapes of Baker Street, casting long shadows across the room where Holmes sat quietly by the fire. The lines of fatigue etched faintly upon his face. The revelations of the previous night weighed heavily upon us all, but there was no time for rest. The case, which had unfolded like a dark symphony with sudden crescendos and subtle refrains, was reaching its final movement. Yet, as I had come to learn in all of Holmes's cases, the final note was often the most unexpected and the most dangerous. Our visitor that morning was Gregson, breathless from the hurried journey and eyes alight with urgent news. "Holmes, Watson, it seems our suspect is not yet resigned to captivity." Holmes rose immediately, his energy returning like the steady beat of a conductor's baton. "Speak plainly, Gregson. There was an attempt to flee last night. Reverend Merriweather managed to evade his guards during a brief transfer. He was last seen crossing the Thames on a private barge, heading toward the east. The shock in the room was tangible. Merriweather, the very man we believed to be the architect of the conspiracy, was now a fugitive. The prospect of his escape threatened to unravel the painstaking work we had done. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "We must act swiftly. Merriweather's flight is a confession of guilt and desperation, but it also offers us an chance to anticipate his next move." I could not help but wonder what plans a man so cunning and resolute might have concocted in his flight. Was he seeking to destroy evidence, rally allies, or disappear entirely? We set out immediately, the fog thick upon the streets, as we made our way to the riverbank, where a swift cutter awaited. Holmes had arranged for discreet surveillance along the likely routes Merriweather would take. The Thames, with its labyrinthine network of docks and hidden inlets, offered countless possibilities for escape and concealment. As the boat sliced through the murky water, Holmes's expression was one of intense concentration, eyes scanning the shadows with the keen vigilance of a hawk. "He will not flee London lightly," he said. "The ledger, the music, and the truth are his burdens. He may seek to silence one last witness or secure his secret in a place thought beyond reach." Our search took us along the winding river, through the maze of warehouses and forgotten docks, where the city's commerce thrived unseen by most. At each stop, we found signs of Merriweather's passage footprints in the mud. A hastily abandoned cloak, a scrap of parchment with a hastily scribbled cipher. Holmes examined the parchment carefully. A message, no doubt intended for a confidant. It references the cathedral shadows and the final key. We must interpret this if we are to anticipate his plan. I felt the weight of the chase settle upon us, the relentless pursuit not only of a man but of the truth itself. Elusive and fragile as a whispered note, our pursuit led us finally to a forgotten chapel on the edge of the city, a place cloaked in silence and the dust of years. The heavy oak door was ajar, revealing an interior thick with shadow and the faint scent of incense long burned away. Holmes motioned for silence as we entered, the echo of our footsteps swallowed by the vast emptiness in the center of the chapel. Beneath a solitary shaft of light from a stained glass window lay a small chest. Holmes knelt beside it, fingers deft as a pianist's, as he opened the ancient lock to reveal a bundle of parchments and a compact ledger, the very document that held the key to the entire mystery. Yet the silence was broken suddenly by a sharp noise, a figure darting from the shadows. Wild-eyed and desperate, Merriweather lunged toward the chest, snatching up the papers with trembling hands. Holmes commanded, but the Reverend was beyond reason. A frantic struggle ensued. the chapel filling with the sharp breaths and scuffling feet of men locked in a battle of wills. Meriwether's strength was born of desperation, but Holmes's resolve was ironclad. At last, with a deft maneuver, Holmes disarmed him, and the Reverend collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his face pale but defiant. "You do not understand," Meriwether gasped. "This knowledge, it is sacred. It must be protected." Holmes knelt beside him, voice steady and compassionate. "Sacred it may be, but so too is truth. Your fear has led you down a dark path, but it is not too late to choose justice." As officers arrived to take Meriwether into custody once more, I watched Holmes carefully. The storm of the chase was over, but the quiet aftermath would linger in the shadows of St. Anne's for years to come. That evening, back in our rooms, Holmes finally allowed himself a moment of repose. Yet his thoughts were already turning to the questions that remained unanswered, the betrayals, the silences that no ledger or hymn could fully explain. The game was perilous. "Watson," he said softly, "but justice, like music, requires patience and perseverance. It is the final note that gives meaning to the entire composition." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deeply within me. The case of the note hidden in a hymn had drawn to its close, but its echoes would resonate long after the final chord had faded. Pipe in hand and eyes distant yet serene, I realized once more that for all his genius, it was his unwavering pursuit of truth that made him truly extraordinary. And in that pursuit, there was a melody that no silence could ever mute. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue, revealed the morning following Reverend Meriwether's capture, was steeped in an uneasy calm, as if the city itself held its breath after the tempest. Yet within the walls of Baker Street, Holmes was anything but calm. His mind, that relentless engine of deduction, churned ceaselessly over the fragments of the case, piecing together a final picture from the scattered notes, whispered secret, and veiled confessions. As the first weak light filtered through the curtains, Holmes stood before the mantel, eyes fixed on a cluster of letters and manuscripts pinned to the wall, collage of evidence that formed the architecture of this tangled mystery. He moved to his desk and carefully retrieved a small, folded sheet of music, worn and yellowed with age. It was the original hymn Mr. Hume had altered, the very "Abide with me" that had concealed so many secrets. Holmes spread the music upon the table, his fingers tracing the pencil annotations with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. "This," he murmured, "is where the final clue was hidden all along." I looked on with curiosity. But how could such a familiar hymn contain a secret so profound? Holmes's gaze sharpened, because the alteration was not merely musical, it was symbolic. Each pencil mark, each subtle shift in the melody corresponds not just to notes, but to letters, dates, and names. A cipher within a composition. He reached for a magnifying glass and began to examine the margins, where faint inscriptions had almost faded into the paper. "Here lies the Chian acrostic, formed by the first letters of each line, spelling out a name long suspected but never proven." My breath caught. "Sir Julius Rathbone." Holmes nodded solemnly. "The benefactor's hand is unmistakable. His signature, woven into the music itself, a silent endorsement of the corruption he sought to protect." But the discovery went deeper. Beneath the name was a date years before the ledger's creation and a reference to an earlier incident, a theft of funds from a different parish. It was a pattern of deceit extending far beyond St. Anne's, implicating a network of influence and greed. Holmes's voice was steady but heavy. This man has played a long game, Watson, weaving a web that ensnares all who seek truth. Yet even the most intricate design has its flaw. He turned to a small, sealed envelope on the desk. Inside this, we find the ledger's true secretor confession, penned in haste by one who sought redemption. Breaking the seal, Holmes unfolded the letter with care. The confession was clear and damning. Sir Julius had manipulated the choir, the clergy, and the parish funds for years, using threats and subtle intimidation to silence opposition. The ledger was his weapon and his shield, but fear had driven him to desperation, culminating in the murders and disappearances that had shaken St. Anne's. As Holmes read aloud the final lines, the gravity of the betrayal settled upon us. The music we sing is meant to uplift the soul, yet I have used it to mask my sins. May this confession bring light where once there was darkness. There was a long silence before Holmes spoke again, voice softer now. Justice, Watson, is not always swift, but it is inevitable. The truth has surfaced, carried upon the very hymns meant to inspire. I felt the weight of his words, the bittersweet knowledge that beneath the beauty of sacred music could lie the darkest of human failings. Yet Holmes's unwavering dedication had pierced that veil, revealing the melody of truth beneath the dissonance of deceit. The final confrontation was swift. Armed with the confession and the ciphered music, we presented the evidence to the authorities, ensuring that Sir Julius Rathbone's crimes were brought to light. His arrest marked the closing of a chapter long shrouded in silence and fear. In the days that followed, St. Anne's slowly began to heal. The choir resumed its rehearsals, the hymns echoing once more with a purity unmarred by hidden agendas. Holmes and I often found ourselves at the church, listening to the familiar strains that now carried a deeper meaning, a testament to resilience and the triumph of truth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow upon the city, Holmes turned to me with a rare softness in his eyes. The case of the note hidden in a hymn has reminded me that even the most beautiful compositions may hold shadows. It is our duty to listen closely to the music and to the silence between. I nodded, grateful for the wisdom he shared and for the privilege of witnessing his extraordinary mind at work. The mystery had been solved, but its echoes would linger, haunting refrain in the tapestry of London's stories. And so, as the bells tolled in the distance, I knew that whatever darkness may arise, the light of reason and justice would endure, carried forward on the wings of a single, steadfast note. The morning after Merryweather's capture dawned gray and heavy, the London mist curling low over the rooftops like a shroud. Yet within the warmth of Baker Street, a different kind of light flickered, a growing certainty in Holmes's eyes as he once again laid out the scattered pieces of the puzzle before him. The room was thick with the faint smoke of his pipe, mingling with the musky scent of old books and leather, a sanctuary for the mind's most delicate inquiries. Holmes handled the original hymn sheet with reverence, as if it were a fragile relic rather than a piece of common paper. His eyes moved with deliberate care Across the faint pencil markings, Mr. Hume had made the very alterations that had seemed at first to be nothing more than eccentric musical choices. "You see, Watson," he said, "these are not merely scribbles, but a carefully constructed cipher. The melody itself is the key to a secret far greater than any might have imagined." He picked up his magnifying glass and traced the annotations, revealing a faint pattern previously unnoticed. "Look here long. The margins, the first letters of each line of the lyrics, form a sequence, an acrostic that spells out a name, not just any name, but the benefactor's, Rathbone." I leaned in closer, a chill rising as the enormity of this revelation settled in. Sir Julius Rathbone, the man who stood above suspicion in all of this? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. A man who concealed his ambitions behind charity and civility, yet wove a web of deceit that ensnared those around him. The ledger was his instrument, and this hymn his veil. Yet what was most remarkable was the date alongside the name years before the ledger's appearance. It referenced an earlier theft of funds from another parish, a pattern of corruption stretching beyond St. Anne's. It was a conspiracy not confined by parish boundaries, but a network of power and greed hidden beneath the sanctity of church walls. Holmes's voice grew somber. The ledger's pages were more than accounts of money. They recorded the manipulation of faith, the silencing of dissent, and the corruption of trust. Reverend Meriwether was but one actor, albeit a pivotal one, in this grander scheme. He then turned to a sealed envelope resting on the table, breaking its wax carefully. Inside lay a confession, hastily written but unmistakably genuine. The author detailed the means by which Sir Julius had manipulated the parish, his orchestration of threats, silences, and, ultimately, murder to safeguard his interests. The ledger, the coded hymns, and the disappearances were all instruments in his desperate symphony of control. Holmes read aloud a passage that resonated with grim finality. "The music we sing is meant to elevate the soul. Yet I have used it to cloak my sins. Let this confession be my penance." The room was silent. "This confession is the crescendo to the conspiracy, Watson. It reveals the true author of the crimes and exposes the elaborate deceit that threatened to unravel the parish." He paced slowly, eyes flicking toward the door, as if expecting the world itself to respond to the truth now laid bare. Yet, even with this, questions remain. How did the music become the cipher? Who else was complicit? And how far does this reach beyond the walls of St. Anne's? I could see the gears turning in his mind, the eternal chase of shadows that defined his genius. The final clue was revealed, but the echoes of the case would ripple outward, leaving questions unanswered and mysteries yet to be uncovered. Holmes folded his hands behind his back and smiled faintly, a smile not of triumph but of solemn acknowledgment. "This case, Watson, reminds us that beneath the surface of the most familiar melodies lie notes we must learn to hear with patience and clarity. Justice, like music, is a matter of timing and balance." As the light outside grew stronger and the city slowly woke from its slumber, I felt a profound respect for the delicate dance of truth. Holmes had conducted a symphony in which every note, no matter how faint, mattered deeply. The final clue had been found, the truth unmasked. But the music, the mystery, would linger forever in the air. Chapter 15: The Final Gathering. Air was heavy with anticipation as we approached the familiar grand room in Sir Julius Rathbone's London residence. The drawing-room was abuzz with a gathering of figures who had played pivotal roles in the recent unfolding of the St. Anne's mystery suspects, witnesses, and those who bore the weight of the parish's shaken trust. The room was richly adorned, yet tonight its opulence felt overshadowed by the gravity of what was to come. Holmes moved among the assembled with quiet authority, his gaze sharp and measured as he observed each face, noting the subtle expressions that betrayed nerves, guilt, or relief. The lighting was dim, candles flickering softly to cast shadows that danced with whispered secrets. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of fear and curiosity, as if all present sensed that the night's revelations would irrevocably alter their fates. At the center of the room stood Holmes, poised and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of certainty. "We are here to bring to light the tangled threads of deception that have for too long woven their shadows beneath the sacred walls of St. Anne's." He paused to let the words sink in, then continued. "Over these past weeks, a sequence of events has unraveled a web of greed, betrayal, and silence. A secret ledger, hidden within the very music that graced our services, has been both weapon and shield for those who sought to deceive." Holmes's eyes swept the room, resting briefly on each person present the steadfast Reverend Merriweather, whose fall from grace had shaken the parish; Mrs. Lydia Harrow, the soprano, whose sharp wit had masked deeper fears; Basil Cotter, the young tenor caught between loyalty and conscience; and Gregson, ever the steadfast guardian of law and order. It is no secret that this ledger has exposed wrongs that transcend mere financial misdeeds. It revealed a deliberate manipulation of faith and trust, a betrayal of the highest order. The room stirred with quiet murmurs, but Holmes raised a hand to command silence. "Tonight I shall recount the sequence of events that led to the deaths and disappearances which have so grievously afflicted this community. I shall expose the misdirections and reveal the true architect of these crimes." He turned to a small table beside him and lifted a faded piece of sheet music. This hymn, "Abide with Me," was the vessel of a hidden message, crafted with care by the victim, Mr. Alistair Hume. The ciphered notes were a cry for justice and a map to the ledger's hiding place. Holmes detailed the discovery of the cipher, the disappearance of the verger, and the attempts to silence those who sought to uncover the truth. Each revelation was accompanied by a quiet but palpable tension. As eyes flickered nervously and breaths caught in anticipation, he spoke of the subtle fractures in the suspects' stories, the inconsistencies that betrayed their involvement, and the careful orchestration of events by Reverend Merriweather, whose desperation had driven him to murder and deceit. Holmes's voice never wavered as he described the final attempt to escape, Merriweather's flight down the Thames, and his capture in the forgotten chapel where the ledger was finally recovered. The confession sealed the case, but Holmes reminded all present that the scars left by such betrayal run deep. At the conclusion, Holmes stepped back, his eyes sweeping the room. "Justice has been served, but the healing of wounds wrought by deception is a task for the living. Let this night mark a new beginning for St. Anne's, one founded on truth, transparency, and faith renewed." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Slowly, the assembly began to disperse, the weight of the evening settling upon each like a solemn benediction as the last guest departed. Holmes turned to me, his face softened by the exhaustion and relief of a case brought to its rightful close. Watson, the final gathering is not merely an unveiling of truth, but a reminder that even the darkest melodies can find resolution in harmony. I nodded, feeling the profound resonance of his words. The note hidden in the hymn had been uncovered, the mystery solved, and with it, the promise of peace for a community long shadowed by secrets. Outside, the night was still, the distant chiming of bells weaving a gentle song through the London-era hymn of justice, of redemption, and of truth finally sung. The evening air was heavy with a quiet urgency as I accompanied Holmes to the grand drawing-room of Sir Julius Rathbone's townhouse, where a somber assembly awaited us. The room, though richly furnished with dark oak panels and velvet drapes, felt subdued, its usual warmth stilled by the weight of recent events. Those gathered were not merely guests, but key figures woven into the intricate tapestry of the St. Anne's mystery, their faces reflecting a spectrum of apprehension, relief, and concealed guilt. Holmes moved among them with measured grace, his keen eyes noting every flicker of expression, every whispered exchange, as though collecting unseen fragments of the truth still suspended in the room's charged atmosphere. The vicar, Reverend Merriweather, stood apart, his once imposing presence diminished beneath the burden of accusation and impending judgment. Nearby, Mrs. Lydia Harrow's poised countenance barely concealed a flicker of unease, while Basil Cotter's youthful face was marked by a mixture of weariness and unresolved conflict. The detective cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention with a gravity that silenced even the faintest murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight not merely to recount facts, but to reconcile with the shadows that have fallen upon this parish. The events that have transpired are a testament to the perils of hidden truths and silent betrayals." He produced the now familiar hymn sheet, delicately handling the faded pages where the secret cipher had been concealed. Within these notes lay a message of desperation and courage, a plea from one who sought to unmask corruption hidden beneath the guise of sanctity. Holmes recounted the discovery of the ledger, the coded hymns, and the trail of vanished and murdered witnesses, threading each revelation with the meticulous care of a master storyteller. He exposed the subtle manipulations, the false confidences, and the tangled loyalties that had ensnared each person present. Turning to Reverend Merriweather, Holmes's voice was firm, yet devoid of malice. "It is clear that your actions, though cloaked in the language of piety, were driven by a desire to protect your own power rather than the parish's welfare. The ledger was your tool and your prison." Merriweather's gaze dropped, the weight of guilt unmistakable. Holmes then addressed the others, acknowledging their varied roles, some complicit through silence, others caught between fear and loyalty. The true resolution requires courage to confront past mistakes and to seek renewal. The room remained silent, heavy with the gravity of their shared ordeal. Slowly, the tension gave way to a fragile acceptance. As if the truth had finally cleared the air, Holmes concluded, "Tonight marks not just an end, but a beginning, a chance for St. Anne's to heal and for its music to once more rise pure and unburdened." As the guests began to depart, I saw in Holmes's eyes a quiet satisfaction mingled with the somber understanding that the echoes of this case would linger long after the doors closed. The final gathering had unveiled more than just facts. It had revealed the human frailty behind the mystery, reminding us all that truth and reconciliation walk hand in hand outside. The first notes of evening bells drifted through the London air, a hopeful hymn rising to meet the night. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The room in Baker Street was heavy with the scent of burning peat and the faint trace of pipe smoke as Holmes paced slowly before the hearth, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the mantelpiece. The hour was late, and the city beyond the windows had fallen into quiet repose. But within these walls, the final act of our strange and intricate tale was about to unfold. I took my place nearby, prepared to bear witness as Holmes unfolded the tapestry of mystery with his characteristic blend of logic, psychology, and quiet brilliance. "My dear Watson," he began, voice calm yet charged with the weight. "This case, at first glance, appeared as a simple, if peculiar, tragedy, a death at a church organ with a coded note. Yet, as we have seen, beneath the surface lay a far more sinister composition." He moved to the table and picked up the original hymn sheet, the pencil annotations worn with age and use. The altered arrangement of "Abide with Me" was not a mere artistic flourish, but a cipher, in ingenious code built into the music itself to conceal a ledger of corruption. Holmes explained how Mr. Alistair Hume, the choirmaster, had stumbled upon a conspiracy involving the church's benefactors, a secret ledger detailing the diversion of funds meant for the parish. This discovery placed him in mortal danger, for those who stood to lose from exposure were willing to silence him permanently. The verger, Mr. Pike, served as guardian of this knowledge. His disappearance signaled the lengths to which the conspirators would go to protect their secret. Holmes's eyes flicked toward a collection of letters and torn papers. Yet even their best efforts could not obscure the truth entirely. The coded messages hidden in the hymns were both a warning and a plea for justice. Turning to the individuals involved, Holmes recounted their roles with meticulous care. Basil Cotter, the young tenor caught between loyalty and fear. Mrs. Lydia Harrow, whose sharp tongue concealed deeper anxieties. Reverend Merriweather, the man who wielded faith as both shield and sword. Holmes's gaze settled firmly on the vicar's folded hands. Reverend Merriweather's position afforded him opportunity and motive. His attempts to manipulate the parish and control the narrative were the driving forces behind the crimes. The ledger was both his power and his prison. He detailed Merriweather's efforts to use coded music and intimidation to conceal his actions, the murders of Mr. Hume, and the efforts to silence others who threatened to expose him. His flight upon discovery was not a sign of innocence, but of a man desperate to preserve what he held most dear, his dominion over the parish's secrets. Holmes paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon the room. "The final note, Watson, is that even the most carefully constructed symphony of deceit is subject to the inescapable laws of truth and justice. The melody may falter, but it cannot be silenced forever." He turned to me with a faint smile. "It has been a complex and harrowing composition, but one that rewards those who listen closely." As the firelight flickered across his features, I was reminded once more why I regarded Sherlock Holmes as the most extraordinary mind of our age's ability to see the hidden patterns in chaos, to unravel secrets woven into the fabric of everyday life. The case of the note hidden in a hymn was at last resolved, its shadows lifted by the steady light of reason. Yet, like any great composition, it left echoes, reminders that beneath the surface of even the most familiar melodies, mysteries await those willing to seek them. The drawing room of Baker Street held a solemn stillness as Holmes prepared to unravel the threads of the intricate tapestry that had been woven over these past weeks. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows upon the walls lined with shelves heavy with books and curiosities, while the faint scent of tobacco smoke lingered in the air. Watson, ever the attentive chronicler, settled comfortably with pen in hand, ready to witness the masterful unveiling of the truth. Holmes began with a calm yet commanding tone. At first glance, the death of Mr. Alistair Hume appeared as a puzzling enigma, murder without apparent cause, marked only by a mysterious note hidden within a hymn. Yet beneath this veneer lay a story of greed, betrayal, and the manipulation of faith itself. He lifted the annotated hymn sheet, this seemingly innocuous melody, "Abide with me," concealed a cipher, a code, devised by the victim himself in a desperate effort to expose a long-standing conspiracy within St. Anne's Parish. Holmes detailed how the ledger, secreted away for years, chronicled the illicit diversion of church funds, implicating prominent figures who had exploited their positions under the guise of piety. He spoke of Reverend Merriweather's role, wielding his spiritual authority to silence dissent, culminating in murder and disappearance. Turning to the assembled characters, Holmes delineated their involvement. The conflicted tenor Basil Cotter, torn between loyalty and fear; the resolute soprano Lydia Harrow, navigating her own precarious position; and the ever-watchful Inspector Gregson, whose diligence had been instrumental in unraveling the case. Holmes emphasized the layered nature of the crime, where music became both a mask and a message, and deception wove itself into every note and silence. The altered hymn was no mere artistic choice, but a deliberate signal, an attempt to guide those willing to listen toward the truth. He recounted Merriweather's desperate flight, the subsequent capture, and the confession that laid bare the full extent of the betrayal. Justice, Watson, is the inevitable resolution of such discord where truth triumphs over concealment. The room seemed to hold its breath as Holmes concluded, "May this case remind us all that even the most sacred melodies may harbor shadows, and it is the duty of those who seek justice to discern both light and dark." As the fire's glow softened, I reflected on the profound complexity of the Kaisa puzzle that had tested not only Holmes's legendary intellect, but the very fabric of faith, trust, and human frailty. The reveal was complete, yet its echoes would resonate far beyond the quiet confines of Baker Street. Chapter 17: Outcome and Justice. The somber light of the early morning filtered gently through the tall windows of the Old Bailey, casting long shadows across the benches where the assembled crowd sat in rapt attention. It was the day when the fate of Reverend Arthur Merriweather and the web of deceit that had enveloped St. Anne's Parish would be laid bare before the magistrates and the public. Holmes and I took our places quietly at the back of the courtroom, our eyes keenly observing the proceedings. The tension palpable as witnesses were called and evidence presented. Holmes's demeanor was composed, but his gaze held a steely resolve, the calm before the storm of justice. The prosecution unfolded the narrative with meticulous care, laying out the ledger's revelations, the coded hymns, the disappearance of the verger, and finally, the desperate flight and capture of Meriwether. The weight of the conspiracy, the betrayal of faith, trust, and sacred duty was made undeniable. Witness after witness testified. Basil Cotter spoke with measured honesty about the choir's unease. Mrs. Lydia Harrow's testimony revealed the tensions and fear that had permeated rehearsals. Gregson detailed the painstaking investigation that had unraveled the secrets hidden beneath the church's solemn hymns. Each account built upon the last, constructing an unassailable case against the accused. When Reverend Meriwether took the stand, his composure was strained but resolute. He neither denied his involvement nor sought to excuse it. Instead, speaking in a voice weighted with a mix of regret and defiance, "I acted in what I believed to be the best interest of the church," he said. The ledger contained truths that, if exposed, would have torn the parish asunder. My actions, though grievous, were born of a desire to protect a sacred trust. Holmes listened intently, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he rose and addressed the court with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He recounted the intricacies of the ciphered hymn, the discovery of the ledger, and the calculated efforts to conceal the truth. The greatest betrayal is not in the concealment of wrongdoing, he said, but in the corruption of the very values one claims to uphold. Reverend Meriwether's actions were a perversion of faith, a manipulation of trust for personal gain. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Holmes concluded. The jury retired to deliberate, the weight of their responsibility settling upon them like a tangible force. Holmes and I waited in the anteroom, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Hours later, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. Meriwether was condemned for his crimes, murder, conspiracy, and the betrayal of sacred trust. Justice, slow but certain, had been served as Meriwether was led away. His gaze briefly met Holmes's, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of the mind that had outwitted his darkest schemes. The aftermath of the trial rippled through St. Anne's Parish. The choir resumed its place in the community, their voices rising once more in hymns untainted by hidden meaning. The ledger, now in the hands of the authorities, was a testament to vigilance and the necessity of truth. Holmes and I often returned to the church, standing quietly as the familiar melodies filled the air, a reminder that even amidst shadows, light endures. One evening, as the sun set over London's rooftops, Holmes mused softly, "Cases such as this remind us, Watson, that the greatest mysteries lie not in the riddles we solve, but in the human hearts we seek to understand." I nodded, reflecting on the journey that had taken us from a single note hidden in a hymn to the unveiling of a truth far greater than any cipher. In Holmes's presence, even the most labyrinthine mysteries became clear, illuminated by the steady flame of reason and justice. I felt a quiet assurance that whatever shadows may fall upon the world, the light of truth, once kindled, will never be extinguished. Chapter 18. Holmes. Final reflection. The quiet of Baker Street in the early hours held a solemn weight. The city's restless murmur softened to a distant lullaby beneath the fog-laden sky. Holmes sat in his favorite chair, pipe in hand, the embers glowing faintly as he regarded the final pages of his notes from the case of the note hidden in a hymn. His expression was one of reflective calm, the sharp gleam of intellect softened by a rare, almost wistful serenity. "Watson," he said at last, voice low and steady, "this case, like many others, has reminded me that the extraordinary often dwells quietly within the ordinary. A single hymn, familiar to so many, became the vessel for secrets that threatened to unravel a community." I leaned forward, sensing the gravity beneath his measured tone. "It was your insight that brought the truth to light, Holmes. Your ability to perceive what others overlook is truly remarkable." Holmes waved a hand modestly. "Elementary, my dear Watson. The challenge lies not in uncovering secrets, but in understanding their human context. Behind every cipher, every code, there beats the pulse of fear, hope, and ambition." He tapped the ash from his pipe, eyes distant. "The Reverend believed he acted for the greater good, yet in his zeal he wrought destruction. It is a cautionary tale, a reminder that conviction without conscience can lead to ruin." Holmes stood and paced slowly by the window, gazing out at the misty streets below. Cases such as these are but notes in the grand symphony of human experience, complex, discordant, yet infinitely compelling. Our duty, Watson, is to listen with clarity and patience, to seek the melody beneath the noise. He turned to me with a faint smile. "And now, as the curtain falls on this chapter, I find myself eager for the next, whatever strange and subtle mysteries it may hold." I smiled in return, grateful once more for the privilege of walking alongside the greatest detective of our age. The case was closed, justice served, and the echoes of its melody fading into the quiet night as Holmes settled back into his chair. Pipe rekindled and eyes closed, I knew that the restless mind would soon be roused again, drawn inexorably to the next whisper of a mystery waiting to be heard. And so the music of life played on unseen, unending, and forever inviting those willing to listen. The quiet of Baker Street settled softly over the room as Holmes reclined in his chair, pipe gently glowing in the fading firelight. The weight of the case, its twists, its shadows, its profound human frailty had finally lifted, leaving a calm that was both relief and melancholy. "Watson," he said at last, voice low and contemplative, "this case has reminded me once again that beneath the most familiar surfaces, whether a hymn, a face, or a quiet street, there often lie secrets waiting patiently to be discovered." I nodded, watching the steady plume of smoke curl upwards, tracing invisible patterns like thoughts made visible. Holmes continued, "Justice, like music, is a balance of harmony and dissonance. The challenge is to discern the truth amid the noise, to listen not just for what is spoken, but for what is left unvoiced." He gave a faint smile, one touched with the quiet satisfaction of a mystery well solved, but also with the humility of a man who knows the world's enigmas are never fully laid to rest. "Let this be a reminder, Watson," he said softly, "that the mind's greatest strength is not in certainty, but in the patient pursuit of truth through shadow and silence." As the embers dimmed, I felt a profound gratitude for the privilege of sharing these moments with Holmes, the man whose restless intellect illuminates even the darkest mysteries. And so, with the city's distant bells chiming into the night, the music of life played on complex, mysterious, and endlessly inviting. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze distant yet piercing. Each case, Watson, is but a movement in an endless symphony. The end of one reveals the beginning of another. He tapped the ashes from his pipe, the gesture thoughtful. We must remain ever vigilant, listening carefully to the subtle notes that others might miss. I settled back, the quiet of the room wrapping around us like a comforting cloak. The case had tested us, challenged us, yet through it, I had seen once more the extraordinary depths of Holmes's mind. The city slept, its breath slow and steady. Inside, the flame flickered low, but the light of reason burned bright. And as I watched Holmes close his eyes, perhaps for a moment's rest before the next adventure, I knew the melody of his genius would never fade.